The room had no windows. Rosalind had chosen it that way, a back bedroom in the farmhouse she'd purchased under a shell company 14 years ago, used twice for work retreats, and never mentioned to anyone since. The walls were bare. The air smelled of cedar and old paper. A single lamp threw yellow light across the folding table, where a laptop sat open, its screen the only living thing in the room. On the screen, a funeral. Her funeral. She watched the black-clad figures move across the frame, the slow procession, the white lilies she had specified in the arrangements, the mahogany casket she had selected herself from a catalog Judith had quietly brought to her 6 weeks ago. She had chosen mahogany because it was dignified, because it was what she would have wanted. She had not anticipated how strange it would feel to watch her own burial from a folding chair in a farmhouse 40 miles outside Atlanta, wearing yesterday's clothes, with a cold cup of coffee beside her hand. Rosalind Steele, 61 years old, founder and former CEO of Steele Group, a logistics and real estate firm headquartered in Atlanta, with a 30-year footprint across the Southeast, was dead. Except she wasn't. She had staged every detail with the precision she brought to quarterly earnings calls. Dr. Harmon, her physician of 20 years and one of 2 people alive who knew the truth, had filed the death certificate, cardiac event, sudden onset, no prior indication. Nobody questioned it. Nobody questioned Rosalind Steele, even in death. Judith Hale, her attorney for 18 years, and the second person who knew, had handled the legal architecture. The announcement. The initial estate freeze. The carefully worded statement to the press that said beloved businesswoman and lasting legacy and nothing that wasn't true. The plan was simple. Rosalind would watch, Griffin would act, and she would finally know. She had told herself it was necessary. That after years of phone calls that lasted 4 minutes, of holidays spent in the same house with a son who looked at her like she was a problem he hadn't solved yet, of watching him quietly withdraw from everything she had built, she needed to know if any of it had mattered to him, if she had mattered. On the screen, the camera Judith had arranged near the entrance caught Griffin arriving. He was alone. He wore a dark gray suit, not black. His face was calm, not composed in the way of someone fighting, simply calm, the way a lake is calm in November, cold all the way down. He shook hands with the funeral director. He nodded at 2 distant relatives. Rosalind barely recognized herself. He did not weep. He did not press his face into his hands. He walked to the casket and stood there, and that was all. Rosalind leaned forward. She had known Griffin for 32 years. She had held him when he was 4 hours old and still unnamed, had watched him learn to walk in the kitchen of their first real house, had sat beside his hospital bed when he was 7 and running a fever that scared her more than any business crisis ever had. She knew the set of his shoulders when he was tired. She knew the way his jaw tightened when he was holding something in. She did not know what she was looking at now. She watched him stand beside the casket until everyone else had drifted toward the reception area. She watched the funeral home staff begin to dim the lights. She watched Griffin stay. He was the last one in the room. He placed his hand on the casket lid, not gripping, not leaning, just resting there, palm flat against the polished wood, and he stood in the half-dark until the staff asked him, gently, to let them finish. Rosalind sat back. She had expected grief or greed. She had not expected this stillness that told her nothing, and somehow everything at once. She picked up the coffee cup, found it empty, and set it down again. She had wanted to know what he would do without her. She was beginning to wonder if she had asked the wrong question. Rosalind Steele had grown up in a 2-room apartment in South Baltimore, the daughter of a man who drank steadily and a woman who left quietly when Rosalind was 9. She had learned early that the world did not owe her softness, and she had made peace with that lesson faster than most. By 16, she was working. By 23, she had her first business. By 38, she was the woman on the magazine cover. She did not talk about South Baltimore. She had left it so completely that sometimes she forgot the specific texture of it. The cold that came through the window, she'd stuffed with newspaper one January because there was no money for weather stripping. She had filed those years away in a part of herself she kept locked. What she hadn't accounted for was that the past has a way of leaking. It leaked into the way she loved her son fiercely, completely, and with a terrified grip that had nothing to do with Griffin and everything to do with a 9-year-old girl who had learned that people leave. She had promised herself, in the hospital the night Griffin was born 6 weeks early, that he would never have what she'd had. No cold winters, no empty refrigerators, no mother who disappeared. She would be there. She would give him everything she'd had to build herself, pre-assembled, no suffering required. She had not understood, until much later, that the suffering was sometimes the point. Griffin had grown up with the best of everything and the weight of all of it. Good schools that came with expectations. Opportunities that arrived pre-labeled with the name of what he was supposed to want. A mother who loved him with such force that there was no room for him to fail, which meant no room for him to be real. He had been a quiet child, watchful. He laughed easily when he forgot to be careful, and then seemed to remember something and pulled it back. The last time they had laughed together, genuinely, was 6 years ago, a Sunday morning, coffee on the kitchen table. Griffin had made a dry comment about the weather forecast, and she had laughed before she could perform not laughing. Then she told him she'd scheduled a meeting with the Holloway team that afternoon, and the ease had left his face like light leaving a room when someone draws the curtain. Then Griffin declined the Holloway acquisition. It was the largest deal Steel Group had pursued in a decade. $63 million, a clean vertical integration that would have tripled their logistics footprint in the Southeast. Rosalind had spent 8 months engineering it. He had sent her a letter. Not a call. A letter, typed on plain paper, 3 paragraphs. He thanked her. He said he believed it was time for him to step back from the board and pursue work that felt his. That felt his. Rosalind had read the letter 4 times. She had called Judith. She had walked around her office for 20 minutes without speaking. And there's only one way to find out. Judith had told her it was a terrible idea. Rosalind had not disagreed. She had made the calls anyway. The plan took 6 weeks to build. "You're going to break something that can't be fixed," Judith had said, sitting across from Rosalind in the farmhouse. "Griffin isn't a stress test. He's your son." "I know what he is," Rosalind had said. "Do you? Because it sounds like you're not sure. And that's the actual problem." Rosalind hadn't answered. She'd looked out the window at the bare November field and thought about a boy with a fever and a woman who had promised, in the dark, to keep him safe from everything. Including, it turned out, the truth. The obituary ran on a Tuesday. By Wednesday morning, the condolence calls had started. By Thursday, Judith had fielded 41 emails and 17 flower deliveries. Then she drove to the farmhouse and sat across from Rosalind. "He hasn't called anyone," Judith said. "I know. He hasn't issued a statement. The board is getting anxious. The estate freeze should hold them for 90 days. Let them be anxious." Rosalind watched the live feed from the security camera outside Steel Group headquarters. Griffin had arrived at 8:47 that morning, an hour earlier than usual. He had not left. The whispers started within 48 hours. He didn't cry, she heard, secondhand, through Judith. Not once. Cold as his mother, but without the bite. "He's waiting. Give him 2 weeks. He'll have advisors in there, restructuring everything." Rosalind heard these things and felt something complicated, not vindication, but a faint nausea. These were people who had sat at her table and called her formidable. And they were looking at her son the way she had been looking at him, assuming the worst and calling it realism. She understood, for the first time, that she had taught them to do that. On the 9th day, Judith called. "He's requested a 90-day hold on all major financial decisions. He's not reviewing the investment portfolio. He pulled the charitable foundation records, the discretionary fund ledgers, the personal correspondence files. He's also been in your old office," Judith added. "The 4th floor, 3 times this week." Rosalind had kept that office for reasons she would have denied. Small, corner-facing, a window looking out over a parking structure and, if you leaned, a strip of the river. She hadn't told Griffin about it. He had found it on his own. On day 14, Griffin sold the Patek Philippe. The watch had been a gift for his 25th birthday, a blue box across a white tablecloth, and something she'd said about legacy and time. He sold it for $42,000. 2 days later, he vacated the penthouse Rosalind had helped him secure and moved into a 2-bedroom unit near Steel Group's original offices in Midtown. The building had a broken elevator, It was the kind of place Rosalind had clawed her way out of. It was the kind of place her son had chosen to move into. On day 19, Judith sent her a photograph. Griffin, standing outside a yellow duplex in Decatur, talking to a woman on a front porch, middle-aged, with the posture of someone who had spent years doing physical work. Griffin was listening. The woman was talking with her hands. Rosalind looked at the address for a long time. Marlene Marsh. She hadn't thought about Marlene in years. Marlene had been a warehouse coordinator, one of a dozen operations staff let go during a restructuring. Rosalind had authorized in 2009. The layoffs had been legal. They had also been wrong. Rosalind had handled it quietly afterward through the foundation's discretionary fund. Marlene's daughter had gotten 2 years of vocational training. Rosalind had never expected acknowledgement. Griffin had found Marlene anyway. Judith had positioned herself near the duplex that day. She called that evening. He stayed for 2 hours. Marlene talked most of it. She told him about the scholarship she'd only just found out it came from your foundation. She said she'd been trying to find a way to say thank you for years. He asked her what you were like, Judith continued. Marlene said you were the hardest person to read she'd ever worked for. She said you never seemed to need anything from anyone. But she said one time, during a site visit, she'd seen you crouch down to talk to a little kid waiting for his mother in the break room. 10 minutes, like he was the most important person in the building. There was a long silence. He thanked her, stood up to leave. Judith paused. Then he sat back down, and he said, I'm sorry she never got to hear this herself. Rosalind ended the call. She sat in the cedar-smelling room and thought about a boy who had driven to Decatur on a weekday to sit on a stranger's porch and listen to stories about a woman he thought he'd lost, who had said, I'm sorry she never got to hear this, in a voice Judith described as wrecked. Leon Carey had known Griffin Steele for 22 years, since the 3rd week of freshman year at Whitmore Academy, when Griffin had sat down uninvited at Leon's lunch table and said, without preamble, you look like you don't want to be here either. Griffin called him on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after the funeral. Leon called back within 10 minutes. They talked around it for a while. Then came the pause that meant someone was about to say the actual thing. Have you ever loved someone and had no idea how to be around them? Griffin asked. Are we talking about your mother? Yeah. Then yes. I think that's one of the more common things humans experience. Every time I did something different from what she'd planned, I could see it in her face. This flicker. I told myself it was disappointment. For years. But I think it might have been fear. I think she was scared, and I read it as judgment, and by the time I figured out there might be a difference, I'd already built so much distance that I didn't know how to close it. Leon waited. I was terrified of her face. Not because she was cruel, she wanted so much, and I could never tell if I was what she wanted, or just the closest available material. The line was quiet. I keep going to these places she apparently helped people. There's a woman in Decatur, a man in Savannah. She put through a technical program. I found a letter from a school in rural Georgia. Thank you for the anonymous gift, and I didn't know. His voice compressed briefly. I lived 32 years with her, and I didn't know the half of who she was. You're finding out now. Yeah. After? Griffin. That's not nothing. Rosalind had heard enough. Stop the phone monitoring, she told Judith. I don't want to hear his private conversations anymore. I've seen enough. On day 26, Judith got eyes in the 4th floor office. The footage showed Griffin, on a Tuesday afternoon. He turned on the desk lamp, pulled a chair to the bookshelves, leafing slowly through her books. Then he opened the bottom drawer. He lifted out a Polaroid from 1998 Griffin at 4 years old in a yellow rain jacket, laughing at something off camera. The laugh of a child who had not yet learned to be careful. He looked at it for a long time. Then he found the letters. 11 of them notes she had written over the years, for birthdays and first days of school, and one for the night before his college graduation. She had folded that last letter, addressed the envelope, and put it in the drawer instead of sending it. She had never found the right moment. He read them slowly, one by one. When he finished the last letter, the longest one, he sat very still, with his hands flat on the desk. Rosalind's hand was pressed against her mouth. She didn't realize she was crying until she felt the wet on her fingers. She had been wrong. Not partially wrong, wrong in the irreversible way that matters. She had looked at a person she loved and decided she already knew what he was, and she had built a plan around that certainty, and the plan was already doing damage she was only beginning to measure. On day 31, Griffin filed articles of incorporation for a new nonprofit. Its stated purpose was the provision of housing assistance, childcare support, and vocational resources to single mothers and their children in underserved Atlanta communities. Its name was the Rosalind House. Judith called at 7 in the morning and read the name twice to make sure. Rosalind sat in the farmhouse kitchen with the name moving through her like something she had no category for. She thought about the plan in her desk at home, the 12-page document she'd started in 2011 and returned to for years without ever committing. The plan for a center. For women who were where she had been. Griffin had found the plan. He had taken a 12-year-old document she'd never shown him and named a nonprofit after her. The watch money. The penthouse. This was where it had gone. He's not taking a salary, Judith said. He listed himself as a volunteer board member. He's secured a space on Ponce de Leon. He's moving fast. Rosalind looked out the farmhouse window at the bare field under low clouds. She had wanted to know what he would do without her. Now she knew, and the knowledge was not the vindication she had built this for. It was something closer to collapse. The night before the center's opening, at 11:40, Judith appeared outside the building on Ponce de Leon. She had come on her own. She stood outside in the cold, and through the glass, she could hear Griffin's voice. He was alone. Judith called Rosalind and opened the line without speaking. She held the phone up toward the glass. "I don't know if this is any good," Griffin said. His voice was quiet and unguarded, stripped of the careful flatness he used in public. "I tried to follow the plan. You had the square footage, the intake model, the emphasis on job training over dependence. I think you would have moved the reception desk. You always moved the reception desk. You said it has to say you belong here before anyone opens their mouth." A pause. "I didn't know how to be around you. I want you to know it wasn't. I wasn't indifferent. I was scared. I was scared my whole life of doing it wrong in front of you. And then I ran out of time to do it right." His voice held there, just barely. "I know it's too late, but I still wanted you to see this." The line was quiet. Rosalind put her free hand flat against the kitchen table. She had staged a death to find out what her son was made of. She had found out. And what she found was not greed, not calculation, not the cold maneuvering of a man waiting for his inheritance. What she found was a son who did not know how to be close to her and who, the moment he thought she was gone, had spent every resource he had trying to finish what she started. She picked up her keys. She drove herself. At 11:53 on a Wednesday night, she backed the old Subaru out of the gravel driveway and drove the 40 miles toward the city alone, in the dark. Judith had texted once. "Are you sure?" Rosalind had not answered. She parked 3 blocks from the building and walked the rest. The street was quiet. The building sat between a dry cleaner and a vacant lot, 2 stories of reclaimed brick, with new windows and a freshly painted door. Above the door, in clean sans serif letters, "The Rosalind House." She stopped, on the sidewalk. The light was on inside. She tried the door. Unlocked. Griffin had always been careless about locking up, a habit that had irritated her for years, and she felt a wave of something warm at the evidence of that familiar carelessness. She pushed the door open and went inside. The front room was larger than she'd expected. High ceilings, exposed ductwork painted white, warm Edison bulbs on track lighting. A reception desk stood just inside the entrance, positioned slightly off-center, angled toward the door. So the first thing anyone saw was someone already turned toward them, already oriented in welcome. She had written that in the 12-year-old document. She had never expected anyone else to read it. She walked toward the corridor, toward the light. On the far wall of the main room, a mural, warm colors, abstract shapes that resolved into the silhouette of a woman holding a child's hand. Griffin was standing beneath the mural. He had his back to her, hands in his pockets, looking up at the painted wall. He heard her footsteps and turned. The silence was total. Rosalind watched her son's face move through things she could not name. They came too fast and overlapped. A system of weather passing over terrain she knew, but had never seen in conditions like these. "I'm dreaming," he said. "No," Rosalind said. "You're not." "I'm sorry," she said. It was insufficient. She said it anyway, because it was true, and because she was 61 years old, and she was done with precision. Griffin stepped back. One step, then another, his body making the decision independently. He stopped near the wall beneath the mural, looking at her, like something had been taken from him, and he hadn't yet decided whether it would be returned. "You were alive," he said. "Yes." "The whole time?" "Yes." "You thought I needed to be tested." "I was afraid," Rosalind said. "That's not an answer. It's the only one I have. I was afraid that what was between us wasn't real. I didn't know how to ask. I have never in my life known how to ask for the thing I needed most. So I built a test instead. Because tests have outcomes I could prepare for, and conversations with you were the one thing I could never prepare for. Because you're the one person whose answer I couldn't afford to get wrong." Something moved across Griffin's face. "I drove to Decatur," he said, his voice quieter now. "There were 11 letters in a box in your drawer. You wrote them. You kept them. You never." "I never sent them," Rosalind said. "Why?" "Because I was afraid the moment had passed. And then, the next moment. And eventually, she looked at her son, standing beneath a mural of a woman and a child, in a building he'd made from her blueprints and her name. Eventually, I ran out of moments, and I still hadn't sent them." The silence stretched. Then Griffin said, "I never left because I didn't care." Rosalind went very still. "I left because I didn't know how to stay and feel like myself at the same time. Every time I did something that wasn't what you planned, I saw that flicker in your face." "I know," Rosalind said. "It wasn't that I stopped." "I know." Her voice cracked. "Griffin, I know. I was afraid, and you read it as judgment, because I went silent so many times when I should have spoken. That is not your failure. That is mine." He uncrossed his arms. "I named it after you," he said, "as I loved you when I had no other way to show it." "I know." I read the filing. He made a sound that was almost a laugh, real enough to change the temperature of the room. She crossed the room and stopped 2 feet from him, close enough to see the exhaustion in his face. 32 days of grief and solitary labor he'd carried without telling anyone it was grief. She extended her hand, palm up, open, the gesture of someone offering rather than taking. Griffin looked at her hand for a long time. Then he put his hand in hers. Not a hug, not a collapse, just his hand in her hand, in the room that had her name on it, in the city where they had both spent their lives passing each other in the hallways of a relationship neither of them had known how to unlock. Rosalind closed her fingers around his hand. She did not speak. Neither did he. They stood there in the building he had made from her blueprints, and the silence between them was not the silence of distance, but the silence of 2 people who had finally run out of ways to avoid each other and found, on the other side of all that avoidance, that the thing they'd been protecting was still there. It was not easy after that. She had not expected easy. There were conversations that did not go smoothly. Conversations where Griffin walked away mid-sentence and came back 20 minutes later. Conversations where Rosalind said the wrong thing in the right direction and had to reverse and try again. The board of Steel Group was told, 6 weeks after the opening, that Rosalind was alive. Several board members resigned. Gerald Fitch sent a card. "I'm glad you're not dead, even if the method was unsound." She kept the card. Leon Carey came to the center's second open house, at Griffin's invitation. He shook Rosalind's hand in the doorway and said, without ceremony, "He talked about you like you hung the moon. I thought you should know that." The Rosalind house opened with 14 families in its first intake cohort. She stood in the back of the main room on opening day and watched the families come in. Young mothers with children on their hips, women arriving alone, shoulders coming down by degrees, as they found that the space looked like what it said it was. A girl of perhaps 8 who let go of her mother's hand and walked to the window and pressed her nose against the glass. The reception desk was staffed by a young woman who turned toward each person before they reached her. "Before anyone opens their mouth, let them know they are seen." Griffin appeared beside Rosalind without announcement, the way he had moved as a child, quietly, suddenly present. "The reception desk looks right," she said. "I moved it twice. I would have moved it 3 times. He was quiet for a moment. you can still move it. She looked at him, watching the room with the satisfaction of someone who had translated something imagined into something standing. She recognized the expression. She had worn it herself, in other rooms, at the end of other long efforts. She had spent 32 years trying to make him into the continuation of what she had built. What he had become was something she hadn't thought to plan for someone who had taken her blueprints and her wounds and her unsent letters and made something that was both hers and entirely his own. That was better than continuation. That was inheritance of the kind that actually lasts. The girl at the window turned away from the glass. She ran back across the room and found her mother's hand, and her mother lifted her, and for a moment, the two of them stood together in the light coming through the clean new windows of a building that had started as a fear and become, through a long series of painful corrections, something closer to love. Rosalind stood beside her son and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed to be said, and because she had spent enough of her life filling silence with the wrong words, and she was, at 61, finally learning the difference between silence that is distance and silence that is home.